Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our discussion of strategic trust or distrust. And this is usually described as distrust between the United States and China, or mistrust. The history of this topic is really one that appeared with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and contemporarily with the Tiananmen incident, when the suspension of mistrust in the interest of common objective of opposing Soviet expansionism disappeared, and the tensions between the ambitions of the United States and China reemerged. This has been a continuing theme for some time in my view. But 2 years ago, very distinguished professor and dean Wang Jisi at Peking University and Ken Lieberthal wrote a piece at Brookings Institution on the very strong distrust being felt between the two sides. And there have been lots of debates about it ever since, including by the eminent head of the Institute of International Relations at Tsinghua University, Dr. Xuetong, who's had some very strong views and articles published on it. So this morning is a chance for us to air the points of view once again. Our panelists include people who really know a lot about this subject. First, we start with Bonnie Glaser, who's Senior Advisor for Asia in the Freeman Chair at the China Studies within the Center for Strategic and International Strategic Studies. She's Senior Associate at the Pacific Forum and consultant for the U.S. government on East Asia. She's served as Senior Associate at CSIS's International Security Program and a consultant to various U.S. government offices, including the Departments of Defense and State. She's got a BA in Political Science from Boston University and is one of the many highly competent people who have been produced by Johns Hopkins SAIS. Dr. Martin Jacques is our second speaker this morning. He's Senior Fellow in the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University and visiting professor at Tsinghua University and a non-resident fellow at the Transatlantic Academy in Washington. He has served as Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the London School of Economics and a visiting professor at Renmin University. But I think he's most famous for having one of these wonderful titled books, When China Rules the World, The End of the Western World and the Birth of a New Global Order. He's a King's College graduate from Cambridge. Dr. Andrew Scobell is here as a senior political scientist at RAND, adjunct professor of Asian Studies at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and was an associate professor at the George H.W. Bush School of Government and Public Service and director of the China Certificate Program at Texas A&M University. His publications are also very well entitled, China's Search for Security and China's Use of Military Forces. He's a Columbia University grad. Finally, Dean of the Institute of Modern International Relations at Tsinghua and Chief Editor of the Chinese Journal of International Politics, Professor Xuetong, is currently the Vice Chairman of the China Association of International Relations Studies and the China Association of American Studies, and a member of the Consultation Committee of the Ministry of Commerce. His publications include Ancient Chinese Thought, Modern Chinese Power, Practical Methods of International Studies, and International Politics in China. And he's a product of both Heilongjiang University and the Institute of International Relations and PhD at the University of California, Berkeley. Each speaker is going to spend about 5 minutes outlining their views. We hope to preserve some time for interchange with the audience here, and we start with Bonnie Glaser.
Great, thank you, Doug. The argument has been put forward by Xuetong, among others, that trust is not necessary for strategic cooperation between nations, that only interests matter. Now, while it is true that strategic cooperation between rivals has taken place and can take place in the absence of trust, I think this begs the question, does mistrust matter? And in particular, does US-China mistrust matter? In my view, the answer is yes. Of course, the nature of mistrust in international relations varies widely. Not all forms of mistrust hamper cooperation or can lead to war. Allies often mistrust each other on specific issues. Of course, we've seen instances of mistrust in the US-Korea, the US-Japan relationship, and other alliances. They are replete with some of these instances. But such mistrust is relatively inconsequential. US-China mistrust is of a very different nature. It is about long-term intentions and ambitions, and this was talked about by Jim Steinberg yesterday morning. China clearly fears that the United States seeks to prevent its reemergence as a great power, and also suspects that the United States seeks to undermine the Communist Party's rule in China. The United States suspects that China seeks to expel its forces from Asia and perhaps even alter the post-World War II international system in ways that might damage U.S. and Western interest. Now, layered on top of these fears, of course, is the classic security dilemma. Mistrust between the U.S. and China, I think, poses risks, and it hampers cooperation. It raises the potential for miscalculation with the attendant risk of escalation. For example, China's resolve to defend its territorial claims in the East China Sea and the South China Sea may be driven in part by fears that the U.S. seeks to weaken China and to undermine the party's legitimacy. Mistrust over Taiwan also remains dangerous. Consider this scenario. If in 2016 a DPP president is elected who rejects the 1992 consensus, but doesn't pursue destabilizing separatist policies as Chen Shui-bian did when he was in power, that president and administration will likely be opposed by Beijing, but may well be supported by Washington. If China confuses that support with its fears of U.S. goals of preventing China's reunification, then the danger of miscalculation and potential conflict will spike. Trust is not always a necessary precondition for cooperation, but mistrust can hamper cooperation, even when interests coincide or overlap. And I think the best case in this instance is North Korea. The United States and China clearly do share an interest in denuclearizing North Korea, but that is apparently not sufficient for operationalizing cooperation. China undoubtedly shapes its policy toward North Korea in part based on its assessment of U.S. intentions toward China. So in the event of severe instability in North Korea, U.S.-China mistrust leaves the two countries and South Korea ill-prepared to respond and at risk of a confrontation on the peninsula, even if it is unwanted. Mistrust prevents the essential coordination of contingency plans to mitigate the dangers of escalation. The U.S. has sought to balance growing U.S.-China strategic competition in the Asia-Pacific region by promoting concrete cooperation with China. And it is notable, I would say, that this has been very difficult and has produced very, very little. Among the results we've seen so far is a small food security project in Timor-Leste and the training of a few scores of Afghan diplomats. In January, the last round of Asia-Pacific consultations produced a small fact sheet of how the U.S. and China are cooperating in the region. It's very thin. One notable aspirational project is to cooperate in establishing a health project in Myanmar. But no progress, again, has been seen so far. So even such minor projects encounter enormous obstacles due to mistrust in part. Xi Jinping's formulation of the new type of major power relations was obviously intended to stabilize the relationship and build trust. But I would argue, in fact, it has increased mistrust. The United States and China initially agreed that avoiding military conflict between a rising power and an established power, the Thucydides trap that Graham Allison highlights, must be avoided. And I think this was a positive consensus. But Xi Jinping subsequently pressed to have the United States accept China's core interests and major concerns. Now, of course, China's sovereignty claims are one of its core interests. And these are in direct conflict with U.S. vital interests in sustaining our alliances in the region. So I think this formulation has, in fact, increased strategic mistrust. So finally, let me say, mistrust, from my view, is a serious problem. And what can we do about it? We have to be very candid about our concerns. We need to dispel, to the extent possible, misperceptions, misunderstandings. I think we're actually doing better on this. We can look, for example, Secretary of Defense's Hagel's recent visit to China, where there were some very candid and direct conversations. We need to be very clear and about our real vital interests and our red lines, as Yao Yunju said in the last panel. And finally, Jim Steinberg has spoken to us about the need for resolve, and I want to say in this regard, I'm heartened by the statement that was made by President Obama on the eve of his trip to the region. He is now the first incumbent president to say publicly that the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands are covered by Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, and I think this will ensure that miscalculation is avoided. Finally, we need to strike a better balance between deterrence and reassurance. Steps must be taken to reduce the risk of accidents and potential unwanted escalation. Current discussions of notifying each other of major military activities, reaching agreement on operational safety at sea and in the air are a very good start. Such steps, I think, need to be accelerated and expanded. I'm not very optimistic that an overall strategic accommodation between the US and China can be achieved, but I think managing and reducing mistrust should be high priorities. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bonnie. Very much look forward to getting into discussion of a lot of what you've had to say, but we now turn to Professor Martin Jacques.
Well, I think that actually if this relationship is going to be successful, it will require strategic accommodation. I want to look at this question in a more general way. First of all, yesterday we really started, more or less, with discussing the rise and fall of powers, and the analogy was made with the First World War, which of course is a very pessimistic scenario. But there's another example which is much more encouraging, which is rarely cited, and actually is a much closer analogy to the situation that we're existing in now, which is the rise of the United States and the decline of the then dominant imperial power, which was Great Britain. This did not result in war. It resulted in a lot of tensions. I noticed in fact, the Council for Foreign Relations has just produced a book on the Battle for Bretton Woods. It produced a lot of tension between Britain and the United States during the course, well, in a limited way in the 1920s, more in the 1930s, and of course, at Bretton Woods, there was Keynes' position versus Dexter White's position over what was going to be the new currency order, and of course the United States prevailed over Keynes' position on the SDR and so on. Now the point is, this was a huge global shift. It ended the gold standard system. It produced a new financial system dominated by the United States, and it did not result in war. It did not result in military conflict. Now, of course, there were special conditions associated with this. There's the history that Britain and the United States have shared over a long period. There are very important cultural affinities, including language. There were the specifics of the Second World War and the involvement of the United States in the Second World War, and of course then after that there was the Cold War. But history is not just made up of generalities, it's made up of conjunctures, and it's made up of specificities. And so this will also be true of the relationship between the United States and China. I mean, who knows over the next 20 or 30 years exactly what problems we're going to have to contend with. I would mention in this context, for example, the possibility of climate change being an overriding and overarching question that humanity has to face. So that's to strike a more optimistic note about these historical parallels. The second point I want to make arises partly from the discussion yesterday morning, but also listening occasionally to remarks made in some of the panel discussions. And that is, the Cold War is an incredibly poor steer and guide for understanding the relationship between China and the United States. The problem is that, of course, we've all been schooled and tutored and by the experiences of the Cold War. Even though we know it's gone, we still are inclined to think in those terms because it was such an extraordinary period in our own lives and the lives, of course, of policymakers. But it seems to me that we should recognize that it doesn't offer us anything except, by and large, misleading clues and insights. China, the Chinese Communist Party, is a totally different creature to the Soviet Communist Party and has reinvented itself in a way which it puts it, I mean, all it has in many ways is still just the name communist. Secondly, and Xuetong made this point yesterday, the Chinese Communist Party is not an ideological organization. It's a pragmatic, administrative, managerial organization which seeks to govern, drawing lessons not only from China but from the world. It doesn't seek to export its model anywhere. I mean, China is, unlike the United States, unlike my own country, is not on a universal, or unlike the Soviet Union, is not on a universalizing mission. I mean, it's proud of its governing system, but it doesn't seek to export it. On the contrary, China, by and large, regards itself to be so different that it doesn't think what it does itself is particularly relevant. Military competition was absolutely fundamental to the Cold War. The Soviet Union sought in its mistaken ways to compete militarily with the United States. I mean, what is striking about China, and I'm sorry, I listen to people say, well, you know, China's military buildup and so on. This is exaggerated. I mean, of course, it's expanding at 10% a year now, but during the 1990s, for example, it actually fell as a proportion of GDP, and it is nothing like the position, of course, the United States. I'll come back to this in a moment. And finally, the world system, the global system, was bifurcated during the Cold War. There was the Soviet Comecon system, and then there was the Western system, and we know what the outcome. Now, we now are dealing with a totally different situation where there is a singular global system which incorporates virtually all countries in the world and which China and the United States are leading players in. So they have, both of them, a profound interest in the prosperity, the growth, and the success of this system from whichever angle that you want to look. And these two countries are now deeply entwined in ways that are much more profound, I think, than is generally recognized. The one thing I think we have to avoid is an arms race. But really, there is no serious signs of an arms race between the two countries. Now, my third point is this. I understand that the United States is concerned about the rise of China. I mean, all imperial powers don't like to entertain the idea that they're in decline. My life has been bounded by the decline of my own country. I was born in 1945, and Britain reached the point now where we could even lose Scotland. So it's not, but we're not unhappy. It's not the end of the world. There's life after imperial greatness. So we should be more philosophic about these questions than policymakers who are preoccupied with the incremental movements in power relations. Now, I think in this context, although China's on the rise, we should not, and I say this as the author of my book, of course, we should not exaggerate where China has got to, or the speed with which this transformation is going to take place. I mean, although China will overtake the United States in terms of GDP within the next several years, probably, maybe 2018, who knows, depends on lots of things. But, the United States will still be in terms of the quality of its economy, far ahead of China for a long time to come. And in many other respects, military expenditure, scientific, quality of its universities and so on, it's far ahead of China and will be far ahead of China for a long time to come. So this is a long process that we're witnessing with outcomes which remain unclear. And I think the key thing here, or a key question, is the ability of the United States to accept China's rise and find ways of including and engaging China in the process and not seeking to restrict or constrain its development. My last, and I think this is very difficult for the Americans, I think. And the key question, it's been very well put by Australian writer Hugh White in the debate that's been taking place in Australia about China. And that is that America, of course, as a sole superpower in the recent period, has had unequal relationships with everyone, with every country, whatever they are. And the rise of China, first and foremost in East Asia, means that essentially the United States is going to have to make a strategic accommodation. And that strategic accommodation is that China and the United States together will have to be the two clear players in this region. And as Professor Yao was saying in the last session, China needs to be, as a consequence, included in the various mechanisms in the region, as opposed to being perpetually on the outside. My last point is this, and it's a more strategic and long-term point. But that is, I hope that in the future, America chooses to, broadly speaking, follow the British path in its relationship with China. That it comes to terms with a natural desire to engage in denial that this is all happening. Secondly, it resists the temptation, although of course there will be inevitably expressions of it, of engagement, of containment and so on. And above all, puts its eggs in the basket of engagement and cooperation with China. And the reason for this is quite simple, apart from the peace issues and so on. And that is, I think, economically, and in other respects as well, this will be in the interests of the United States. Because just as the rebalancing is a recognition that East Asia is extremely important to American interests, so strategically, its relationship with a China which I think in the longer run will become the dominant country in the world, and certainly the dominant economy in the world, America has an enormous amount to gain from a close, even bilateral relationship between the two countries. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I will make two quick points. The book you referred to from Bretton Woods has the author sitting here in the front row, Ben Steele, if you want to talk to him more about it.
I didn't know it was you, Ben.
Secondly...
I'm in charge of your PR.
Yeah. Buy him a drink for all the times he's held it up. The second point is that one of the critiques that's been repeatedly sounded of President Obama's policy towards Asia as he embarks today on his travel to the region has been that he tried in his first year to engage China on climate change and cooperation and to reach some kind of strategic accommodation and found himself rejected. It would be interesting to come back and discuss that as we go forward. Now we turn to Andrew Scobell.
Okay. So I think the premise of this panel is that there is a significant reservoir of strategic distrust between the U.S. and China. And not to jump on the Bonnie's bandwagon, but Professor Yan yesterday talked about the importance of shared interests, shared national interests as a basis for U.S.-China cooperation. And I think that's definitely a necessary component. But I don't think it's sufficient for the kind of constructive, enduring, robust, cooperative relationship that everyone in this room would like to see between the US and China. So I think to move forward, we really need to try and address the roots or the dimensions of the strategic distrust between the two countries. And I want to address three dimensions of that. First, cultural stereotypes. Okay, you say stereotypes. All right, they're just stereotypes. But I think these stereotypes are very powerful, and for each country, they give coherence to a particular narrative of the past and a projection of the future. So don't underestimate. I mean, I'm a student of Bob Jervis, so perceptions are very important in international relations. And by the way, I'm a recovering political scientist, so but that's my problem. So cultural stereotyping. Yesterday, some of the speakers talked about the importance of nationalism, national identity, and I think that really is important. Both the United States and China have strong senses of their own national identity, but they also reference that identity by looking at the other, in contrast to the other. So for China, there is this enduring belief that China has a distinctive cultural, strategic culture, tradition that's pacifistic, defensive-minded, virtuous, sedentary, agrarian, continental. You get the idea. And the way China tends to look at the United States, again, as a stereotype, but a powerful one, is that the U.S. represents the antithesis of that. It's a Western kind of, epitomizes a Western kind of cultural tradition that is more warlike, aggressive, expansionist, selfish, maritime, and again, stereotype, but a powerful one. I've picked on China, but you could also pick on the United States. The United States sees itself as also as a virtuous country that stands for freedom, democracy, human rights, and it is our mission to make this a reality around the world. And many in the United States tend to see China in terms of the antithesis of that, as a Communist Party dictatorship. So enough about that. You know that. But these things influence perceptions on both sides and contribute to this distrust that we've been talking about. Second point, talk about mirror imaging. Mirror imaging, I think, is often mischaracterized. I've just pointed out how China and the United States see themselves as culturally distinct and different from each other, right? So there is not blanket or wholesale mirror imaging going on here. But I do think where mirror imaging comes into play is in when one country looks at the other's intentions and the logic behind policies and actions. So they tend to mirror image rationality. So if you look at what China does, if China looks at what the US does, or what the US looks at what China's doing, and tries to understand why are they doing this? If they're puzzled, the default position is to think of it in US terms or Chinese terms, as the case may be. And if you don't understand, if it doesn't seem logical in those terms, then there's only one of two things can be possible, right? There's either an ulterior motive behind this, what the other side is doing, or second, it's irrational or crazy or risky or dangerous. Right? That's sort of the binary way to interpret the actions of the other. So you've got this mirror imaging, cultural stereotyping. You put two and two together, or 1 + 1 together, and you get an exacerbation of what everyone knows is going on, or what everyone refers to, which is the security dilemma. So that's been talked about. I'm not going to say anything more about it, except to say that as a committed constructivist, I think the security dilemma, along with these other problems I mentioned, are learned behaviors. Ergo, they can be unlearned. Now that's easy to say, very difficult to do. So how do we move forward? Well, it isn't going to be easy, as I was suggesting, but we need to break down the us versus them dichotomy, the way of thinking. And the way to do that, I think, is to overcome what I call the empathy deficit. Right? On both sides, you have, both neither the U.S. or China is particularly good at putting itself in the shoes of the other. Right? Whether it's in Washington or Beijing, they tend to be very insular places, very, very self-absorbed, and prone to arrogance. Both capitals. So this makes it rather difficult to address this empathy deficit and to address, to chip away at this chasm of strategic mistrust. Thank you.
Wow, that's a very concise characterization. It's interesting you talk about this mirror imaging in different cultures. I was prompted to think back to a war game I was involved in, which posited an incident off the coast of the Korean peninsula near the DMZ. The North was involved, the South was involved, and the U.S. had the George Washington nearby. And the Americans decided, we don't want this to get more tense, so let's remove the George Washington from the Yellow Sea, get them east of Japan, out of trouble. And the Chinese response to this was the Americans are moving to a better place to attack from. So we have some problems to get over on our strategic mistrust. Professor Yan, my good colleague.
Okay. The Jervis book, Perception and Misperception, do not have only strong impact on Americans political scientists, also have very strong impact in China. And that's, I think, even have an impact on our policymakers. And some of them fully believe the mutual trust is the base for the cooperation between the major powers. Without mutual trust, you can never develop any cooperation or strategic cooperation among them. Actually, I hold a totally opposite view. I have published 2 articles and against this idea. And the argument is very simple. Because in the history, we have seen all these rivalry powers cooperate with each other without any mutual trust. Like during World War II, the cooperation between Soviet Union and U.S. and Great Britain, and China and the U.S. cooperate each other, and in the 1980s and even today. And there's no mutual trust, but we can cooperate on a lot of things. So I do not want to deal on get in detail about that. Today I got something from the previous discussion that seems to me people concerned that, okay, if the mutual trust do not play a very important role and is not the basic part of the base for cooperation, but then the distrust will have a negative impact on the cooperation. Well, from my understanding, the trust, no trust, and distrust actually just different levels of same thing. And from my understanding, trust, no trust, and distrust is an ideological issue. It's based on the ideological judgment. So between China and the US can neither change others' ideology. And I don't think you can make America believe communist is more benign, is more progressive than the Republicans, and than the American democracy. You can never change them. And certainly the same, you cannot change the Chinese policymaker believe that, the Western democracy is much more better than ours. You can never change them. This is an ideological issue. So from my side, this is an irrational judgment. Trust, distrust, mutual trust, no trust, this irrational judgment. But then miscalculation, misunderstanding is a wrong rational judgment. That's different. You make a rational calculation, but then you make the wrong judgment. That's very possible because you do not have enough information. So the exchange program, the contact, all these things can help improve mutual understanding. You understand what? You get more understanding you get more information about the other side. You know more objectively about the other sides. It doesn't mean you trust them. Very possibly, the more you know them, you trust them less. This guy is really bad. How can we trust him? So from my understanding, for Jervis' book, his analysis based on that the misunderstanding is possibly because of the ideology and possibly because of a lack of information. So for the part of the lack of information, we can improve that for both sides and get more information about each other's side. But that part about ideological differences and make them know a mutual trust, you can never change. So I think it's happy. We see that Wang Yi, our current foreign minister, delivered a speech at the Princeton University. He changed the tone about the mutual trust between China and the US. He said that the base of cooperation is a shared interest, and the mutual trust as auxiliary measures to strengthen that base. Strengthen what? Strengthen the shared interest. So that's auxiliary. I do not deny, I do not argue that the trust has a mutual trust that have a negative impact. I just argue that we can cooperate without mutual trust. And the final thing I want to see, and nowadays you can find that the China and the US, if you compare what happened today and 20 years ago, I mean immediately after the end of the Cold War, China and US has cooperated more and more in many fields, and including military. And now we have a military exchange program. We even have a joint, not a maneuver joint, or the maritime rescue, right? Maritime rescue program, very small, tiny. But then we have something in the military sector. How about the mutual trust? I don't think our mutual trust improved much better than in early 1990s. The trust is still the same. We don't trust each other for more than 2 decades, but then we developed the cooperation more and more. So my argument that we cannot rely on the mutual trust because that's really not reliable. Second, that's my also last argument that some people, Paul Doug just now said that someone regarded mutual trust as a precondition for strategic cooperation between China and the US. I think that's very harmful. That means that, okay, since we have no mutual trust, so we cannot have any cooperation. So they gave up. They don't want to do anything because, hey, we cannot do nothing. We can do nothing because we have no mutual trust. My argument is that no matter we have a mutual trust or not, we should develop cooperation based on the common interests. So I think mutual trust, my core argument that mutual trust is not a precondition for strategic cooperation between China and the US.
Thank you, Professor Yan. At the end, you come to something that was on my mind. Often when you read analyses of Chinese foreign policy and cooperation or non-cooperation with other countries, the assertion is made that in the bilateral negotiations, the Chinese will always attempt to establish a principle first and try to establish that the principle under which all the details will later be described for cooperation or fulfillment of one's mutual interests. And the counter-argument is made that Americans and Westerners generally don't want to go to the principled position. They'll let the principle emerge from practical cooperation step by step. So that if I see you telling me, as Bonnie indicated earlier, the Chinese are going to tell me that they're having an exercise in a certain part of the Western Pacific or on Chinese mainland, and the US does a similar sort of thing, that over time we will build up to a kind of level of trust. Anybody have a comment on the validity of this argument that the Chinese system requires, Chinese thinking patterns require first establishing the principled statement about how you're going to proceed, such as a statement such as establishing a new type of major country relationship, and then you fill in the details later, or do you have to follow the Western approach of factual, pragmatic cooperation first, long before trust is established? And if there's no interest in commenting on that, we'll move on to something else. Bonnie, you have got a reputation for having promoted a lot of efforts to develop confidence-building measures between Taiwan and China and other powers. And yet you're presentation this morning really dwelled on the difficulties of getting there. Can you amplify a little bit of where you see the way out of this challenge? Is there a path to a more trusting relationship that builds on confidence-building measures?
Well, I assume you want me to talk about this in the U.S.-China context,
Yes.
because I could talk about it in the China-Taiwan context, but that would be distracting. I think that we need confidence-building measures, conflict avoidance measures, and I guess this goes to the point that you just made about whether it is necessary to have principles first. And I think that as you correctly say, the Western approach is to establish these habits of cooperation first. And I think that this has proven over time to work in Europe. It has proven certainly in the U.S.-Soviet relationship. Whether we ever got to mutual trust is a different story, but we were certainly able to avert war. And the specific CBMs that were put in place, agreements such as the 1972 Incidents at Sea Agreement, were very, very important in that regard. So I think in the U.S.-China relationship, we are really just beginning down that path. Although in 1998, the MMCA, Military Maritime Consultative Agreement, was set up. At the time, it was referred to by Kurt Campbell, who is in the Defense Department, as an empty vessel, which we would then put things in. And it's remained empty for a very long time. So I am pleased to see that there are some real things that are now being agreed on. Whether they will all add up to real forms of cooperation remains to be seen. But I think that the purpose primarily is avoiding accidents, certainly agreeing on how we operate on the sea and in the air, I think is critically important. And this new proposal by Xi Jinping to notify each other about military activities could have very wide application, and I think could also contribute to what I would call greater predictability in the U.S.-China relationship. And I think it is the absence of predictability that can be the cause of accidents and potentially, of course, distrust.
Anyone else have a comment? Why don't we open it to the floor and seek your questions. We have General Yamaguchi here first, and then we'll take a couple questions, and then we'll ask the panel to respond.
Thank you very much. My name is Yamaguchi from Japan. I was very much impressed by four speakers' point. And particularly, maybe Bonnie has answered to my first question. But my question to Bonnie is, what are the key obstacles for the U.S. and China to seek cooperation between rivals? That is one question. And I was impressed by Dr. Scobell's point about empathy. I was thinking about the Cold War period. U.S. and Soviet Union used to have some kind of empathy, or the U.S. tried to understand what the Soviet Union would think, and the Soviet did the same thing. In that sense, what is the condition, current situation between U.S. and China in terms of level of empathy between U.S.-China? Is it much lower, far lower than the U.S.-Soviet, or similar? Thank you.
Thank you. Could you pass the microphone to your right there? Thanks.
Leifer Gisli, I'm a professor at Ewha Women's University and a research fellow with the Asan Institute. First, let me say happy birthday, Bonnie. Thank you. Okay. Thank you for being a mentor for so many up-and-coming or trying to be aspiring China specialists, myself included. My question for the panel regarding U.S.-China distrust has to do with China's relationships with its neighbors. And I think that in my conversation with Chinese colleagues, sometimes the importance of how China interacts with its neighbors is underestimated in this context of U.S. perceptions of China. I wonder if, and I know this is a hypothetical, but in the pressure that we see between China and its neighbors, including the Philippines, Vietnam, of course, Japan, not only over territory and islands, but we see this recent instance of the Mitsui vessel being seized over historical compensation disputes, which I think is related to our future of history theme. When Americans observe that sort of pressure, I think there's concern. If there was something like an EP3 incident between China and one of its neighbors, would there be the sort of restraint that China shows in its relations with the United States? And so how does that sort of concern by Americans about Chinese escalation control contribute to U.S.-China trust issues? Thank you.
One more question from anyone? Well, we'll start with those two then. Bonnie, do you want to respond to General Yamaguchi to begin?
Sure. I would go back to the point in response to the question about key obstacles to U.S.-China cooperation that I made earlier about the suspicion about each other's long-term intentions. And in that regard, I want to comment on something that Martin Jacques said earlier about whether or not the United States is actually prepared to accept China's rise and the integration of China into the global system. And I would argue that the United States has quite proactively sought to promote both of those goals. I find it quite difficult to find examples of the United States constraining China's rise. There is no country that worked harder, I think, to get China to join the WTO. And for people who would claim today that the United States is seeking to exclude China from TPP, I would say that is incorrect. It has been made clear by U.S. officials that this is an open agreement should China choose to accept whatever agreement is negotiated, which is, of course, still not yet concrete. But there are many examples where the United States has worked, I think, quite actively to encourage China's participation in regional and multilateral institutions. I can't think of a regional institution that we sought to exclude China from. Quite the opposite. It was China that, when it wanted to set up the East Asia Summit on an ASEAN +3 basis, didn't want the United States to be included. So I think that both sides do need to do more to address each other's long-term suspicions about long-term intentions. The U.S. clearly can do more and will constantly have to do this. It's not just rhetoric saying we accept China's rise, we want to see China be stable, prosperous, etc. Yes, we have to continue, I think, to signal that we want to integrate China. And the willingness of the United States to have China work in, participate actually in RIMPAC this year is a very good example of that. So hopefully China can also do more to address the suspicions that the U.S. has or concerns that the U.S. has about China's long-term intentions.
Xuetong?
Okay. Well, I think the two questions are very interesting. And I want to respond to the question, what kind of level China and the U.S. strategic cooperation can develop to. And one thing is quite clear, and this is not a trust, this is a rational judgment or the calculation. China and the U.S. strategic cooperation can never reach the level of between the U.S. and Japan. And because the U.S. and Japan are mutual alliance, China and the U.S. cannot be alliance. So I think this is not a trust or not. This is not whether belief, this is a rational calculation. So I don't know, never I don't mean 1,000 years. I mean the next 10 years or 20 years. And the second question about the Americans' distrust of China because of our conflicts with the neighbors. Well, I don't know whether this is true or not. If it is true, or it makes it has logic there, that means no one trusts the U.S. because U.S. relationship with everyone, right? And the question from the Japanese colleague means that they do not trust the U.S. They suspect the U.S. may develop the cooperation with China too much. And the worry about the U.S. may not that solidly support Japan in terms of the conflicts with China. So I don't know whether the Japanese colleagues, you have the fully trust in U.S. or you still have a suspicion about that. And so from understanding that, the trust is always subjective. It's based on your imagination and idea. It's not based on the rational calculation. So my last point is that China and the U.S. at this moment, we develop a lot of cooperation without the mutual trust expected by some people. It means that China and the U.S. should spend more efforts to considering how to enlarge the common interests or shared interests or complementary interests, like the security in the cyber security, in the space, in the nuclear, and all of the issues. I think there's more and more issues and climate, more and more global threat to the human being. So we can't develop the cooperation in these fields without mutual trust. So finally, I say, and we certainly need to understand each other's belief and the others' thinking and others' policy. I think that's just for to make your calculation more objective. It doesn't mean that you can change their political orientation. So nowadays, some people concerned that if China changes ideology and the U.S. and China can trust each other, I doubt it. And the U.S. still have a lot of mutual allies share the same ideology, but they still not trust you that much. I don't think that's a U.S. mistake. And the U.S. as the only superpower today, and certainly they have to deal with every country. They need to keep the balance among their relationship with everyone. So everyone wants the U.S. is friends to his own country only. That's impossible. That's also cause distrust of the U.S. But that's not U.S. fault.
Martin?
Yeah, on the question of trust and cooperation and so on, I feel that this is too limited a way of looking at it. We need other terms as well to understand what's going on. I mean, what else is there? I mean, I think your point, you see, about empathy is very important. Because something else has happened over the last 20 years in the relationship between China and the United States, and indeed the perception of China in the world more generally. And that is, I think, there's a much greater knowledge about China than there was 20 years ago. There's a much greater understanding of China. I mean, this even includes, most recently, and still relatively limited, but nonetheless quite a significant shift in an understanding and appreciation of China's governance system, which used to be automatically kicked into touch by Western political thinking. But there's now a school of thought which is growing, which is that we've got things to learn from China's governing system. But more fundamentally and more widely than that, just an appreciation of China's dramatic transformation, economically what it's managed to do, and so on. And I think that this is very, very important, because what it underpins then is the ability and the willingness and the capacity and the determination of governments to make a relationship with each other and to understand each other. I mean, this is very, very important. There's a wonderful book I'm sure everyone's very familiar with here by Ruth Benedict on Japan, written by someone who never had even been to Japan when she wrote it. But it's a very insightful analysis of Japanese culture. And I think this is an example of the kind of understanding and the kind of mutual appreciation that we need to have on a much more widespread basis. I mean, the reason that complicates the relationship between China and the United States is hitherto, with the exception of Japan, and it was only a partial exception, all countries which have been major powers in the modern world have been Western countries. And the great historic shift we're seeing now with the rise of China is that China is not a Western country and never will be a Western country and will remain profoundly different for as long as the eye could ever see. And China is not alone in this, because the 85% of the world's population, which until very recently was essentially agrarian and relatively backward, is in the process of modernizing. So the world of the future is going to be so different. And China, in that sense, is not an exception, but it is, in some degree or other, emblematic of the future. And so these kind of differences that you're talking about, Scott, are very, very important, not just in the case of China, but more generally. Now, on the question of China and its neighbors, you know, I think that the way this has been presented in a lot of the Western media has been rather ill-balanced. I mean, it is not true that China has a problem with all its neighbors. For example, all the members of ASEAN. It's had, in particular, a problem with two members of ASEAN. One is Vietnam, which is not least an historical problem that goes back at least 1,000 years, and the other is the Philippines, which, well, exactly why the Philippines has handled a dispute like it has is something that needs to be interrogated. But in terms of China's relationship, for example, with the other ASEAN countries, I mean, like Malaysia, for example, which they're both disputants to the Spratly Islands, but the relationship with Malaysia has remained very solid over a long historical period. Indonesia, China's relationship with Indonesia has, relatively speaking, I think, improved a lot. So I just think this characterization that China can't get on with its neighbors is a false generalization. There are two countries in particular in the ASEAN region. Now, the Northeast Asia is a different question, but in terms of South, and we've seen the very interesting complexities with China's relationship with South Korea during the discussion on the plenary session that we've just had. Oh, I didn't respond to... Bonnie, I agree with you that the United States has had much to be proud of in its relationship with China. I mean, you know, there is history here, there is hinterland. Since the early 1970s, the United States and China established what proved to be very positive strategic relationship, which then over time helped to create the condition for China's transformation. So I'm not saying that, absolutely not saying there's simply been an antagonistic, or is simply an antagonistic relationship. I agree with you about that. I disagree with you, though, about the extent to which the United States, in this relatively contemporary period, has been open to the situation of China. For example, you take the question of the Asian pivot and the rebalancing question. I mean, did the United States seek to consult China about it? To discuss what its intentions were? To involve it in what it was going to do? To discuss the TPP with it? No. No, there was nothing like that. The United States moved on the question of its alliances, of course, with its allies on a bilateral basis, and on the TPP, again, China was not in any way consulted. The discussions about China's relationship with the TPP have only proceeded subsequently. So my position is, yes, America has done a great deal positive for the rise of China, but it could be better.
Do you want to respond?
I'd just like to respond very briefly, and that is that, to go back to the point that Doug Paal made earlier, actually the origins of the rebalance really are not just Secretary Clinton's article in 2011 or President Obama's trip to Australia, but I think really go back to very early in the administration, and our former National Security Advisor Tom Donilon's talked about this, And at that time, there was a very concerted and comprehensive effort to engage China, because the assumption was that big problems in the world, strategic issues, climate change, the rebalancing of the global economy, countering proliferation, these things cannot be accomplished without Chinese cooperation. And so there was, in a sense, consultations with China. There were, from the very beginning, China has been considered a pillar of the rebalancing. Now, as things evolved between the US and China, and in Chinese foreign policy, and particularly treatment towards its neighbors, the pivot to Asia took somewhat of a different turn. But should the United States have to have a consultation with China about whether we're going to pursue TPP? Again, this is an open question. And if China wants to be part of it and shape it, it was not excluded. But it's quite clear that the provisions, the nature of the TPP agreement is not something that China wants to be part of, at least in the near term. But I'm sure we can debate this over lunch.
My point is exactly that the United States should have talked to China about the TPP and its proposals in relation to it.
There's a very
and
interesting...
it didn't, and that is, the fact it didn't is significant.
There's a very interesting editorial in the New York Times this week about how the Obama administration should talk to the American people about TPP, because they haven't been sharing enough information on the subject. And I think there's some truth in that, and it's also some truth. But you know, in fact, the TPP was agreed to by the George W. Bush administration during the high point of U.S.-China cooperation in that period of U.S. governance, and it was only picked up somewhat late by the Obama administration. Being a Democratic administration, it had to deal with conflicting constituencies on this subject, and for that reason it's also not been very open to the American people about what's happening in TPP. Moreover, I think the Chinese side was very susceptible, and many of the people who have made comments in the Chinese media in the early days of the renewed discussion of TPP under Obama were political people who didn't understand what was really happening in the negotiations, and this led to some misunderstanding. But as I've repeatedly visited China, and others have, we've seen that Chinese officials increasingly appreciate the opportunity that TPP will probably be for China, at a point in China's current reforms where those reforms take China to a point where it would be advantageous to join TPP. But General Yao Yunju has patiently been waiting to ask a question. We have a few minutes to here in the front.
Actually, I just want to add to what Martin said, that China sometimes feel that, and also Bonnie has confirmed the concerns of mine that for regional arrangement, China has to apply, to request. Even for the participation of RIMPAC exercise, China has to make a formal request, and also other regional arrangement. So it's open, but you have to make a request, and then we can give you the consent and things like that. And my question actually is to Bonnie about the Diaoyu Island. The recent repeated statements about the U.S. Government position, the 3 points. First, no position on sovereignty. Second, is covered by the alliance treaty because the administration is the Japanese administration over the island, and the third, peaceful means to solve the issue. So, actually, my question is, if it is not recognized as Japanese territory, how can we define administrative power over the island? The island are unmanned, is not inhabited, not like Dakdo Island or the Northern Territory. They are people living on these islands, but Diaoyu Islands has no people. No one is living there. So how do you define administrative power, administration over the island? And if it's only patrolling around the waters, now China is also patrolling in the waters, around the waters. So at least the administration over the island is disputed now. So how can the United States logically or legally apply the defense commitment to unmanned islands over disputed administrative power?
Okay, we have just a couple minutes left, and there's one question up here in the second row. If you can get a microphone to the second row, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Professor Yoon Young-Kwan of Seoul National University. I have a question about the assumption underlying your presentations. I've got the impression that you developed your presentation on the assumption that the states in both countries, are unitary actor. And interstate level, you focused on interstate level analysis of this trust-mistrust issue between two powers. Don't we have to pay at least some attention on the domestic level? What I'm saying is politics of interest group. For example, the influence of military sector in both countries, or military industry complex, the influence of that in domestic politics, in decision-making procedure, because the military sector is the strongest interest group.
I think we get the point.
Which has a negative some view on interstate relations. So I do appreciate your view on that.
Thank you. Does anybody want to take on? Bonnie, you were asked very directly by General Yao, maybe on the question of defining administration.
I'm not a lawyer. I'm grateful I'm not a lawyer. So I will not give you a legal response. I will simply say that it's quite clear that it was China's strategy after the government in Japan purchased 3 of these 5 islands in September 2012, that by beginning these patrols, even though, of course, the first time that the incursion took place into the territorial waters was really December 2008, but it wasn't routine until after September 2012. It was quite clear that China's goal was to challenge Japan's administrative control over those islands. And so really your question is, why won't the United States and other countries recognize that that goal has been achieved? So in 1972, I think from the US perspective, the administrative control was transferred to Japan. And I think President Obama repeated in this interview that was published today that there should be no unilateral changes in the status quo. So I don't think that other countries are willing to accept that because China has regularly conducted these patrols in the territorial waters and contiguous waters around the disputed islands, that somehow changes the fact that Japan has administrative control.
Has the purchase of the islands changed the status quo of the sovereignty status of the islands?
The question is, has the status quo been changed by the purchase of the islands?
My answer to that is no. I'm sure that you and many others in China would hold a different view. But I don't think it was Japan's intention, and I think intention is important in this regard. There was no intention to change the status quo. In fact, Japan was clearly trying to prevent a far worse situation from emerging if the governor of Tokyo, Ishihara, had purchased those islands. China knew very well what Japan's intentions were, but it was an opportunity that China just could not let pass up, shall we say.
For a final word to Xuetong.
Okay. We see this response have fully trust in, at least have more trust in Japan than in China. The reason is not because Japan has less conflicts with neighbors. Japan has conflict with all immediate neighbors. And we have 22 neighbors which only have conflict with a few less neighbors. So the trust in any country, Americans' trust in any country is not based on anything but because of whether they have conflicts with the U.S. or not. They don't trust that any country has a conflict with the U.S. They trust anyone who will support the U.S. So from my understanding that in the future, China and the U.S. and we certainly need to concern how to improve mutual trust, but we cannot have too high expectation. The final point is that the improve the contact, and it's helpful to improve mutual understanding between China and the U.S. And at this moment, from my understanding, there's if not over 100, it's already near 100 channels between China and the U.S. on the dialogue. I think China and the U.S. It's quite understand each other. It's quite fully. So we have a proverb in China. We say that because of a misunderstanding, men and women fall into love, and because they fully understanding, so they divorce.
On that punchline, Andrew had one final question.
Yeah. Just to answer the question about empathy, the state of empathy. What's the state of empathy between the U.S. and China? It's not enough, right? And that's, I think, one of the reasons I mentioned earlier for that, but it's also because, I mean, the question of the security dilemma is now discussed routinely by Chinese scholars and American scholars, but I think, especially on the Chinese side, it's largely lip service. And to go further requires you to do some delicate dancing and to be brave and to take risks, because if you start talking about how the other side sees it, you know, rather than ascribing hostile intent, nefarious plots, you risk being called unpatriotic or worse. Now, of course, that happens in the U.S. too. I mean, I've written a whole book trying to understand Chinese perspective on their security and foreign policy. And I could be called a panda hug, right? But so honestly, it requires people to take risks to make progress on this.
On that final word, thank you very much. Please join me in expressing appreciation.